History is filled with tragedies that were not caused by fate, but by moments of human error. A single wrong decision, missed signal, or lapse in judgment has at times led to catastrophic loss of life. Here are 5 of the worst tragedies caused by human mistakes, where the cost of error was measured in lives. It began quietly, almost invisibly, under the cover of darkness. While Bhopal slept, a deadly cloud crept through its streets, sinking low to the ground and wrapping the city in a poison no one could see but everyone would feel. By dawn on December 3, 1984, central India had awakened to a catastrophe that would scar generations and earn its place as the worst industrial disaster in human history. At the heart of the tragedy was a pesticide factory on the outskirts of the city, owned by Union Carbide India. In the early hours of the morning, a storage tank malfunctioned and began releasing methyl isocyanate, an extremely toxic chemical gas. Within just 2 hours, roughly 40 tons escaped into the air. Carried by the wind, the gas spread rapidly across Bhopal, seeping into homes, alleyways, and sleeping lungs. More than 500,000 people were exposed before the sun even rose. Death followed swiftly. Families woke up choking, their eyes burning, their chests on fire. Many never made it out of their homes. Thousands died within hours, collapsing on roads, in doorways, or while fleeing in blind panic. Hospitals were instantly overwhelmed, unable to cope with the sheer scale of suffering. Morgues overflowed, forcing authorities to conduct mass cremations and funerals as the city struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. Those who witnessed the aftermath describe a scene of unimaginable horror. People gasped for air, as if drowning on dry land. Entire neighborhoods were paralyzed by fear and confusion. Amid the chaos, ordinary citizens stepped forward to help strangers, carrying the injured, sharing water, and offering comfort where none could truly be found. It was an act of humanity shining through devastation, but the nightmare did not end with the first wave of deaths. Methyl isocyanate attacks the lungs, eyes, and nervous system. Survivors suffered violent coughing, vomiting, blindness, and a crushing sensation of suffocation. Because the gas was heavier than air, it settled close to the ground, meaning children were exposed to even higher concentrations. Many lived, but with bodies permanently damaged. Official estimates stated that around 3,500 people died in the days immediately following the leak. Yet the true toll unfolded slowly, year after year. By 2024, human rights groups estimated that more than 22,000 deaths could be directly linked to the exposure. Hundreds of thousands more were left with chronic respiratory disease, neurological damage, weakened immune systems, and severe psychological trauma. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and neonatal deaths increased dramatically among women who had inhaled the gas. The disaster also pushed already poor communities deeper into poverty. Many families lost their primary wage earners, leaving women and children especially vulnerable. Medical costs mounted while the ability to work vanished. For Bhopal's residents, survival itself became a lifelong struggle. As if the gas leak were not enough, a second, slower catastrophe followed. The abandoned factory site was never fully cleaned up. Thousands of tons of toxic waste remained buried in and around the plant, slowly contaminating groundwater and soil. Decades later, communities continue to drink poisoned water and live on polluted land, trapped in what activists describe as an ongoing environmental disaster. Justice, meanwhile, proved painfully elusive. Survivors and families of the dead fought tirelessly for accountability and compensation. By the early 2000s, more than 500,000 people had received some form of financial relief, but the amounts were shockingly low. Families who lost loved ones received, on average, just a few $1,000s, hardly enough to cover medical care, let alone a lifetime of loss. Legal battles dragged on for decades. Union Carbide's American parent company faced lawsuits, but the Indian government ultimately accepted an out-of-court settlement, far lower than initially demanded. The company's CEO was briefly detained, later charged, and eventually labeled a fugitive when he failed to appear in court. He was never extradited and died years later without facing trial. In 2010, 7 former employees of the Indian subsidiary were convicted of causing death through negligence. Their sentences, 2 years in jail and modest fines, were widely condemned as symbolic rather than just. For many survivors, it felt like a final betrayal. Nearly 5 decades had passed since the deadliest aviation disaster in history unfolded on the Spanish island of Tenerife, yet the scale of the tragedy remained difficult to comprehend. Even after 48 years, the loss of 583 lives in a single catastrophic moment continued to haunt aviation history, and the families forever changed by it. What made the disaster even more devastating was the knowledge that none of the passengers or crew were ever supposed to be in Tenerife that day. On March 27, 1977, 2 Boeing 747 jumbo jets, KLM Flight 4885 and Pan American World Airways Flight 1736, collided on the runway at Los Rodeos Airport. The impact and resulting inferno left only 61 survivors. Everyone else perished in a disaster that unfolded in seconds, but left wounds that would never fully heal. The tragedy reshaped aviation safety worldwide and became a grim lesson in how human error, miscommunication, and circumstance could align with fatal consequences. The sequence of events began a day earlier. On March 26th, the Pan Am aircraft departed Los Angeles for Spain, with a scheduled stop in New York before continuing to Las Palmas in the Canary Islands. Meanwhile, the KLM Boeing 747 left Amsterdam on March 27th, bound for the same destination. Both flights were routine, carrying passengers unaware of the events about to divert them into history. At the time, political tensions simmered in the Canary Islands. A separatist group seeking independence planted a bomb inside a florist shop at Las Palmas Airport, injuring several people. The group later threatened a second explosion. Fearing further attacks, authorities closed the airport and suspended all flights. As a result, incoming aircraft, including the Pan Am and KLM 747s, were diverted to Los Rodeos Airport on Tenerife. Los Rodeos was a small regional airport, ill-equipped to handle the sudden influx of large international aircraft. With only one runway and limited taxiways, congestion quickly became severe. Aircraft were parked wherever space allowed, including on taxiways normally used for movement. To make matters worse, the airport's elevated location made it prone to rapidly changing weather conditions. Thick fog began rolling across the runway, dramatically reducing visibility. When Las Palmas Airport eventually reopened, both jumbo jets prepared to depart. The Pan Am aircraft was ready to leave promptly, but its path was blocked by the KLM jet, which had chosen to take on a large amount of additional fuel. Once refueling was complete, air traffic control instructed the KLM aircraft to taxi down the runway, turn around at the far end, and prepare for takeoff. The Pan Am jet was told to follow the same runway and exit at the third taxiway to clear the path. Visibility continued to deteriorate. Fog reduced sight lines to less than 100 meters. Taxiway markings were unclear, and runway centerline lights were not functioning. In these conditions, the Pan Am crew missed the intended exit and continued taxiing down the runway. Unaware, they were still directly in the takeoff path. At the far end of the runway, the KLM aircraft completed its turn and lined up for departure. Inside the cockpit, tension mounted as delays accumulated. As the captain began advancing the throttles, the first officer raised concern that takeoff clearance had not yet been received. Communication with the control tower followed, but radio transmissions overlapped and were misinterpreted. Before full clearance was explicitly given, the KLM aircraft began its takeoff roll. The control tower, not expecting the aircraft to move, misunderstood the KLM crew's transmission and believed the jet was merely positioned for departure. Meanwhile, the Pan Am crew reported they were still on the runway. That message was heard in the KLM cockpit, but the captain believed the runway was clear and continued accelerating. With only seconds remaining, the Pan Am crew saw the KLM aircraft emerge from the fog, charging directly toward them. They attempted evasive action, accelerating in a desperate effort to clear the runway, but it was too late. The KLM jet attempted to lift off prematurely, but its undercarriage and engines struck the Pan Am aircraft, tearing through its fuselage. A massive explosion followed. The KLM aircraft was engulfed in flames and destroyed instantly, killing all 248 passengers and crew. Fire spread rapidly across the Pan Am jet, killing 326 people. 61 survived, most escaping through a rupture near the front of the aircraft. One KLM passenger who had chosen to remain behind in Tenerife became the sole person originally booked on Flight 4805 to survive. Investigations later concluded that the primary cause of the disaster was the KLM captain initiating takeoff without clearance. However, the tragedy was not attributed to a single mistake. Poor visibility, congested airport conditions, overlapping radio transmissions, missed taxiway exits, and cockpit authority dynamics all played critical roles. 60 years after one of the deadliest rail disasters in British history, survivors, witnesses, and rescuers gathered at Harrow and Wealdstone station to remember the lives lost in a catastrophe ultimately caused by human error. What unfolded on a fog-choked October morning in 1952 was not the result of mechanical failure or sabotage, but a tragic chain of human mistakes, momentary lapses in judgment, and safety systems that failed to compensate when concentration slipped. On October 8, 1952, dense autumn fog blanketed northwest London, severely limiting visibility across the rail network. Trains were running behind schedule, pressure was mounting on drivers to recover lost time, and the conditions were ripe for disaster. At 8:19 a.m., a local train traveling from Tring to Euston stood at Platform 6 at Harrow and Wealdstone station. It was running late but stationary, its passengers unaware that danger was rapidly approaching from behind. Moments later, the Perth to Euston Express, also delayed by fog, thundered down the same line. The driver, attempting to make up time, failed to notice or respond appropriately to a critical danger signal. That single human mistake, missing a red signal, proved fatal. The express train slammed into the rear of the stationary Tring train with immense force, crushing carriages and sending twisted metal cascading onto neighboring tracks. The consequences of that error multiplied almost instantly. Debris from the first collision spilled across adjacent lines, directly into the path of another incoming service traveling from Euston to Liverpool and Manchester. With no time to stop, the third train plowed into the wreckage. The impact was so violent that parts of the train were thrown into the air, tearing into a station footbridge and collapsing sections of it onto the wreck below. In total, 112 people were killed and more than 300 injured, making it the worst railway accident in England and the second deadliest in the United Kingdom. The scale of destruction stunned even seasoned emergency responders. What had begun as a missed signal escalated into a multi-train catastrophe within minutes. Among the first witnesses was 14-year-old Gilbert Powell, a scout on his way to technical college. Hearing an enormous crash, he instinctively rushed toward the station and was confronted by a towering heap of shattered carriages and mangled steel. Despite his age, he joined the rescue effort, crawling into crushed compartments and confined spaces where adult rescuers could not fit. His small frame allowed him to locate trapped survivors beneath the wreckage and direct firefighters to their positions. Rescue operations continued for hours under appalling conditions. Fog, smoke, steam, and debris made navigation nearly impossible. Some victims were so badly injured that identifying them became a grim challenge. Emergency crews worked tirelessly, lifting carriages while people remained trapped beneath them. A group of U.S. Air Force medical personnel who happened to be aboard one of the trains immediately assisted, providing life-saving care amid chaos. One nurse, later remembered as the Angel of Platform 6, devised a simple but effective system to prevent fatal medication errors. Using lipstick, she marked victims who had been treated or given morphine, ensuring no one was overdosed during the frantic rescue. Her quick thinking highlighted how human decisions, both good and bad, shaped the outcome that day. Subsequent investigations made it clear that the disaster was not inevitable. The official inquiry concluded that the primary cause was the failure of the Perth to Euston driver to observe and respond to a danger signal. Fog played a role, but it was human judgment under pressure that proved decisive. At the time, there was no automatic warning system to override human error, no safeguard to stop a train when attention wavered. Rail historians later described the tragedy as a preventable sequence of events. Although signaling procedures had improved since earlier disasters, safety technology lagged behind known risks. The Harrow and Wealdstone crash became a turning point, accelerating the introduction of automatic warning systems designed to intervene when human concentration failed. On July 9, 1918, a quiet stretch of railroad in West Nashville became the site of one of the most devastating transportation disasters in American history. Two passenger trains, each traveling at full speed, collided head-on near the intersection of White Bridge and Harding Pikes in the Belle Meade area of Tennessee. By the time the wreckage stopped moving, 101 people were dead and more than 200 others were injured, marking the deadliest single day ever recorded in U.S. railroad history. That morning, one train was arriving from Memphis while the other had just departed Nashville's Union Station. Both were carrying unsuspecting passengers, unaware that a fatal mistake lay ahead on the tracks. The collision occurred at a sharply curved section of rail known as Dutchman's Curve, a horseshoe-shaped bend that severely limited visibility. As the two locomotives rounded the curve from opposite directions, neither crew had time to react. Each train was traveling at approximately 60 miles per hour. There was no opportunity to brake, no chance to slow, and no warning before the engines slammed into one another with catastrophic force. Witnesses later described the moment of impact as explosive. The force of the collision derailed the engines instantly, sending cars telescoping into one another. Wood and steel shattered, boilers ruptured, and flames erupted almost immediately. The crash transformed the peaceful countryside into a scene of chaos, fire, and unimaginable destruction. Cornfields bordering the tracks were strewn with debris, twisted metal, and human remains. Residents living nearby were jolted awake by the sound. One man, who was a child at the time and later recalled the event in a 1983 interview, remembered hearing the crash followed by screams that seemed to go on endlessly. The cries of the injured and dying echoed through the night as rescuers struggled to reach victims trapped in the wreckage. Recovery efforts stretched on for more than 12 hours, and the sounds of pain and panic made sleep impossible for those living nearby. Emergency response in 1918 was limited by the technology of the era. Firefighters, railway workers, and volunteers rushed to the scene, but the scale of devastation overwhelmed them. Fires burned fiercely, fueled by ruptured engines and wooden passenger cars. Many victims were trapped inside burning compartments, while others were crushed by collapsing cars. Some bodies were so badly burned or mangled that identification proved impossible, leaving families without closure. Historians later noted that the cleanup process was grim and prolonged. Workers combed through surrounding fields, collecting body parts scattered by the force of the collision. The sheer brutality of the scene defied description. Even seasoned railway employees struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Among the dead were laborers, travelers, and families simply trying to reach their destinations. One of those killed was Johnny Gordon, a 21-year-old railway worker from Colesburg, Tennessee. His death left a lasting wound on his family. His younger sister, only 9 or 10 years old at the time, grew up with the shadow of that loss hanging over her life. Years later, she would show her grandchild a newspaper clipping preserved in a trunk, explaining that her beloved older brother had died in the wreck. The tragedy affected not only her, but also her parents, who were forced to endure the unimaginable pain of losing a son. For many families, the crash became a defining moment passed down through generations. Stories of loved ones lost, bodies never identified, and final goodbyes never spoken became part of Nashville's collective memory. The disaster was not just a transportation failure. It was a deeply human tragedy rooted in preventable error. While investigations followed, the crash ultimately highlighted the dangers of inadequate communication and signaling systems. At the time, rail operations relied heavily on human judgment, handwritten orders, and strict adherence to schedules. A single mistake, whether miscommunication, misjudgment, or failure to account for track conditions, was enough to send two massive trains hurtling toward each other. There were no automated systems to intervene, no fail-safes to stop the disaster once human error had set it in motion. A century later, historians, descendants, and community members gathered near the tracks to honor those who died. At a memorial ceremony, the names of all 101 victims were read aloud, and flowers were placed above the rails where the collision occurred. The act served as both remembrance and warning. Even after more than 2 decades, the memories of the Gaisal train disaster have not faded for those who witnessed it firsthand. For many, the horrific images resurfaced painfully when news broke of the Balasore train accident in Odisha. Scenes of mangled carriages, dismembered bodies covered in debris, desperate cries from passengers trapped inside, and families frantically searching for loved ones reopened wounds that time had never truly healed. For survivors and rescuers alike, the past seemed to collide with the present. One such person was Pintu Roy, a resident of Milanpalli in Siliguri, and the convener of the Siliguri Volunteer Blood Donors Association. When he watched reports of the Balasore tragedy, the memories of August 1999 came flooding back with startling clarity. The Gaisal accident, which had occurred in West Bengal's North Dinajpur district, had left an indelible mark on his life. The unfolding scenes on television mirrored what he had once seen with his own eyes, bringing back the same sense of dread, helplessness, and sorrow. At the time of the Gaisal crash, Roy had rushed to the site as soon as he heard about the accident. Along with a friend, he joined the rescue efforts, stepping into a nightmarish landscape that he would never forget. Bodies lay scattered across the area, while grieving relatives wailed uncontrollably beside the wreckage. Injured passengers cried out in pain, and others trapped inside twisted compartments begged rescuers to save them. The overwhelming scale of suffering made the scene feel unreal, as though it belonged to another world entirely. Watching the Balasore disaster unfold years later, Roy felt as though history was repeating itself. Once again, multiple trains were involved, and once again, the collision had produced devastation beyond words. In his recollection of Gaisal, one train had ridden over another, crushing compartments beneath its weight. The upper coaches caught fire, trapping passengers inside. Many people lost their lives to flames, while others were fatally injured by the sheer force of the impact. The horror, he felt, was impossible to fully convey through language alone. One critical difference between the two disasters, Roy observed, was the timing. The Balasore accident occurred in the evening, when visibility was better and emergency response could begin more quickly. As a result, some passengers may have managed to escape with their lives before conditions worsened. In contrast, the Gaisal tragedy struck in the dead of night. Darkness, confusion, and a lack of immediate resources severely delayed rescue operations. Precious hours were lost before help could reach many of the victims, and that delay contributed significantly to the high number of deaths. The death toll at Gaisal eventually reached 280, a staggering figure that reflected both the violence of the crash and the slow pace of rescue. In Balasore, the reported death toll rose to 288, eerily close to the numbers from Gaisal. For Roy, the similarity was deeply unsettling. It underscored how little room there is for error when it comes to railway safety, and how devastating the consequences can be when systems fail or human mistakes go unchecked. Roy also recalled how local residents had stepped in to assist during the Gaisal rescue. With official resources stretched thin, villagers gathered whatever tools they could find, including gas cutters, to try to free those trapped inside the wrecked coaches. Ordinary people became first responders, driven by desperation and compassion rather than training or equipment. Their efforts saved lives, but they also highlighted the lack of preparedness for disasters of such magnitude. As news of Balasore continued to unfold, Roy emphasized that the severity of that accident was no less than what he had witnessed at Gaisal. In both cases, multiple trains were involved, and the destruction was amplified by cascading failures. One mistake led to another, turning routine journeys into mass casualty events. The emotional toll on survivors, families, and rescuers was immeasurable and long-lasting. Even after 24 years, the Gaisal accident remained painfully alive in the minds of those who saw its aftermath. The Balasore tragedy proved that without sustained attention to safety and accountability, history has a cruel way of repeating itself. For people like Pintu Roy, The hope is that remembering these horrors will finally lead to meaningful change, so that future journeys do not end in the same unimaginable loss.